Welcome back to another chilling episode of Fictional Crime, where love and obsession blur, and the end is always deadly. In today's story, we delve into the life of a woman whose loneliness led her into a forbidden love affair with a man who had taken a vow of celibacy. But when that love turned to obsession, it ended in murder. This is the tragic story of Julie Reynolds, a lonely housewife, and Father Mark, a Catholic priest. Together, they embarked on a dangerous path of forbidden passion and guilt. In the end, their affair became a deadly game of betrayal, despair, and ultimately, death. Julie Reynolds was the picture of suburban contentment. At 32, she lived what many considered to be a comfortable life: a nice house in a quiet neighborhood, a devoted husband who worked in the military, and two small children who were the center of her world. She was the kind of woman people admired from afar: polite, well-groomed, always with a friendly smile on her face. But behind that smile, Julie's life was unraveling. Her husband, Ryan, had been deployed on and off for the better part of the last 5 years. He was an officer in the military, which meant that when he was home, his time was still devoted to training, preparing for the next mission. Even when he was physically present, it felt to Julie like he wasn't truly there. The weight of his constant absences began to take a toll on their marriage. At first, Julie tried to keep things together for the sake of their children. But as the months turned into years, the loneliness became unbearable. Julie's days were filled with the monotonous routines of motherhood: laundry, cleaning, cooking, taking care of the children's needs. She loved her kids, of course, but their constant demands left little room for her to breathe. She was tired of the isolation, tired of doing everything alone, and tired of feeling like she had disappeared into the role of wife and mother, losing herself in the process. Nights were the worst. The silence of the house, once the children were asleep, amplified her feelings of emptiness. She would sit in the living room, staring at the television, not really watching, just trying to fill the void of those long, lonely hours. It was during one of these dark nights that Julie first began to consider going to church again. She hadn't been a particularly religious woman, but St. Mary's was just a few blocks away, and the thought of getting out of the house, even if just for an hour, felt like a small escape. She hoped that maybe in the quiet of the church, she might find some peace. What she didn't expect was to find something far more dangerous. Father Mark was relatively new to the parish. In his mid-30s, he was young for a priest, and his presence had breathed new life into the small, aging congregation. He had a warmth about him that drew people in, a genuine kindness that made people feel like he truly cared about their struggles. He wasn't the type of priest who preached fire and brimstone. Instead, he offered gentle guidance, focusing on love, forgiveness, and understanding. For many, his sermons were a comfort. For Julie, they became something more. From the moment Julie first saw Father Mark, she felt a connection she hadn't expected. It wasn't just that he was handsome, though he was, with his dark hair, chiseled features, and kind brown eyes. It was something deeper. When he spoke, it was as if he was speaking directly to her, as if he could see the sadness she carried and wanted to ease her pain. Julie found herself returning to St. Mary's week after week, not just for the services, but for the chance to be near him. At first, their interactions were brief: polite smiles exchanged after Mass, a nod of recognition when their eyes met. But soon, Julie began to linger after services, finding reasons to stay behind, hoping for a moment to speak with him. One Sunday, as the last of the parishioners filed out of the church, Father Mark approached her. "Julie, how are you?" he asked, his voice gentle but full of concern. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of how much to reveal, but there was something about the way he looked at her, something that made her feel safe. I'm all right," she replied, though the words felt hollow. Father Mark's brow furrowed slightly, and he took a step closer. "You don't have to pretend with me," he said softly. "If something is weighing on you, I'm here to listen." And that was all it took. In that moment, the walls Julie had built around herself crumbled, and she found herself opening up to him in a way she hadn't opened up to anyone in years. She told him about Ryan's deployments, about the strain it had put on their marriage, and about the overwhelming sense of loneliness that had taken over her life. Father Mark listened intently, never interrupting, just offering his silent support. When she finished, she felt lighter, as if a burden had been lifted off her shoulders. "You're stronger than you realize," Father Mark said, his voice calm and reassuring. "God sees your struggles, even when you feel alone. You're never truly alone." His words, though meant to comfort her, had a different effect. It wasn't God that Julie felt connected to, it was him. Father Mark had become the person she looked forward to seeing each week, the person who made her feel seen in a way no one else did. And with each passing Sunday, her feelings for him grew. Father Mark, for his part, was beginning to struggle with his own emotions. He had taken a vow of celibacy, a vow that had never been difficult for him to uphold until now. There was something about Julie that drew him in, something he couldn't quite put into words. He found himself thinking about her more than he should, wondering how she was, worrying about her loneliness. At night, in the quiet of his rectory, he would kneel and pray for strength, for guidance, for the will to resist the temptation he knew was growing within him. But each time he saw Julie, his resolve weakened. Their conversations after Mass became more frequent, and soon they were meeting outside of the church. It started innocently enough. Father Mark would stop by Julie's house to check on her, offering support and a listening ear. But as the weeks went on, their connection deepened. They began spending more and more time together, finding excuses to meet in quiet places where no one would see them. They would talk for hours, sometimes about faith, sometimes about life, but always with an undercurrent of something unspoken between them. Then one day, everything changed. It was a rainy afternoon, and Julie had been feeling particularly low. Ryan had called the night before, but the conversation had been brief and stilted, leaving her feeling more disconnected from him than ever. She hadn't slept, and her mind was racing with thoughts of Father Mark, of how different her life felt when she was with him, of how alive he made her feel. She decided to go to the church, hoping that seeing him might bring her some comfort. When she arrived, the church was empty, save for Father Mark, who was sitting in one of the pews, lost in thought. Julie hesitated for a moment before approaching him, unsure of what to say, but when he looked up and saw her, his face softened and he smiled. "Julie," he said, standing to greet her, "what brings you here?" I just needed to see you," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Father Mark's expression shifted, a flicker of something, concern, confusion, desire crossing his face. "Is everything all right?" Julie shook her head, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "No, I don't think it is." Without thinking, she reached out and touched his hand. The moment their skin made contact, something ignited between them. Father Mark froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he should pull away, knew this was a line he couldn't cross, but he couldn't bring himself to let go. The weight of his desire, of their unspoken connection, was too much to resist. Before either of them could stop it, their lips met in a tentative, electrifying kiss. It was brief, just a moment of weakness, but it was enough to shatter the fragile boundary between them. Both pulled back, breathless, staring at each other in shock. For a long moment, neither spoke, the air between them thick with tension and guilt. I'm sorry," Father Mark stammered, his voice shaky. "This was a mistake." But Julie wasn't ready to let go. "No," she whispered, stepping closer. "It wasn't. You feel it too, don't you?" Father Mark looked away, his mind racing. He did feel it. He had felt it for weeks. But this wasn't who he was. He had taken vows, committed his life to God. And yet, in Julie's presence, all of that seemed to fade away. From that moment on, their relationship took on a new intensity. What had started as a friendship became a full-blown affair. They met in secret, their passion consuming them both. Every stolen kiss, every whispered confession only deepened the connection between them. Father Mark was torn between his desire for Julie and the crushing weight of his guilt. Each time he stood at the altar to lead Mass, he felt like a fraud, like he was betraying everything he stood for. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't bring himself to end things with her. Julie, on the other hand, had never felt more alive. After years of feeling invisible, of being nothing more than a wife and mother, she had found someone who made her feel wanted, desired. She had convinced herself that this was love, that what she and Father Mark shared was something sacred, something worth fighting for. She began to fantasize about a future with him, imagining a life where they could be together openly, without hiding. But Father Mark wasn't willing to give up his vows, and this realization began to gnaw at Julie. As the weeks went on, the strain of the affair began to take its toll on Father Mark. He became more withdrawn, more distant. The guilt was eating him alive, and he knew he couldn't continue living this way. One evening, after a particularly intense encounter, he made a decision. He couldn't do this anymore. He had to end it. When he told Julie, her reaction was immediate and visceral. "What do you mean it's over?" she demanded, her voice rising with anger. "I can't keep living this lie," Father Mark said, his voice heavy with regret. "I've betrayed my vows, betrayed God. I can't continue like this." Julie's hands trembled as she stared at him, disbelief and rage warring in her mind. "You're just going to walk away after everything we've been through?" "I don't want to hurt you, Julie," he said softly, "but I've lost myself. This isn't who I am." Julie felt her world collapsing around her. The man she had built her hopes on, the man she believed loved her, was walking away. Desperation clawed at her insides. She had given everything to him, risked everything, and now he was abandoning her. She couldn't let that happen. She wouldn't let that happen. The days that followed were a blur for Julie. Her mind was consumed with thoughts of Father Mark, of how he had rejected her, of how easily he had cast her aside. The pain turned to anger, and the anger turned to something darker. She began to think about revenge, about making him pay for what he had done to her. If she couldn't have him, then no one would. The idea took hold of her like a poison, spreading through her thoughts until there was no room for anything else. She made a plan. She would confront him one last time, and if he refused her, well, she had brought a knife. That night, Julie went to the church. It was late, well after dark, and the building was empty. She found Father Mark in the chapel, kneeling in prayer. The sight of him, so serene and detached, filled her with cold fury. She approached him slowly, the knife hidden beneath her coat. "Julie?" Father Mark's voice echoed in the quiet space, startled to see her there. "What are you doing here?" She didn't answer at first, just stood there watching him. Finally, she spoke. "I came to say goodbye." Father Mark rose to his feet, confusion and concern etched on his face. "Goodbye?" Without warning, Julie pulled the knife from her coat, the blade glinting in the dim light. Father Mark's eyes widened in horror. "Julie, no!" But it was too late. She lunged forward, driving the knife into his chest. His body crumpled beneath the blow, his eyes filled with shock and pain as he collapsed to the ground. Blood pooled around him, staining the sacred floor of the chapel. Julie stood over him, watching as the life drained from his eyes, her mind numb to the horror of what she had done. The man she had loved, the man who had consumed her every thought, was gone. In the aftermath, Julie was arrested and charged with murder. The details of their affair shocked the community, but for Julie, none of it mattered anymore. She had lost everything: her freedom, her family, her future, and all because of a love that had turned to obsession. As she sat in her prison cell, staring at the cold gray walls, she thought about Father Mark, about the life they could have had, and about how, in the end, her love had destroyed them both. And that's the story of Julie Reynolds, a woman whose desire led her down a path of obsession, betrayal, and murder.